Here's an experiment for you. Take passionate experts in human resource technology. Invite cross-industry experts from inside and outside HR. Mix in what's happening in people analytics today. Give them the technology to connect. Hit record. Pour their discussions into a beaker. Mix thoroughly. And voila, you get the HR Data Labs podcast, where we explore the impact of data and analytics to your business. We may get passionate and even irreverent, but count on each episode challenging and enhancing your understanding of the way people data can be used to solve real-world problems. Now, here's your host, David Turetsky.
Hello and welcome to the HR Data Labs podcast. I'm your host, David Turetsky. Like always, we try and find you fascinating people inside and outside of the world of human resources to talk to you about HR data, analytics, and HR technology. Today, we have with us a very special guest, Kathi Enderes from the Bersin Company. Hello, Kathi. How are you?
Good. How about you, David? Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. And as always, we have with us our co-host, Dwight Brown from Salary.com. Hey, Dwight, how are you?
Hey, David. I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I'm doing awesome because we're going to speak with Kathi on something really cool today. But before we talk about that, Kathi, why don't you give our listeners some background as to who you are and what you do at the Bersin Company?
Sure. Thank you, David. And so I am, as you said, David, the SVP of research at the Josh Bersin Company. My background is actually not in research. My background is actually in mathematics. So that's something that people might know about me, but I swear I'm not the oddest, weirdest geek. I can actually hold the conversation and all of that. But I did start in Austria, where I'm from. I started my career studying theoretical mathematics. So that's where I started out on. And my PhD is in mathematics because I wanted to be a professor at the University of Vienna for mathematics. But then it turned out it was actually not for me because I looked at all these very smart professors and they were very, very smart, but very detached from any kind of reality. Right. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to be like them. And I didn't want to be like them. So I thought I'd do something else. So I started in management consulting. So I started with Ernst & Young quite a while ago. Management consulting, didn't know anything about business, but learned a lot about business just working in management consulting in Austria. And then I got the opportunity to move to London, and I moved with PricewaterhouseCoopers at that time to London and was able to continue management consulting there. And then I had the opportunity to move to San Francisco in 2000, actually. Oh. .com craze. Sure. So PwC was looking to hire a lot of people. And so it took me one phone call to move to San Francisco in 2000. And I've loved it there, and I stayed there for the last 22 years, worked in management consulting, PwC, IBM, and then I joined one of my clients as a director of organizational effectiveness, worked on change management in HR and performance management, talent management, and people analytics, of course, as well, because analytics, when you're in consulting, is really key because you can't do any kind of current state assessment or any kind of work without knowing where the company is, whether that's on people side, whether it's on diversity, equity, inclusion, change management, organizational outcomes. So I went in an organization because I wanted to know what it's like to be in that job that we always consult into. And that was great. And then I had the opportunity to join an even bigger healthcare company, Kaiser Permanente, actually, and was working there for 8 years in organizational effectiveness and people analytics I had as well, and a number of other things that are all related to this area of change, organizational effectiveness, talent management, performance management. And then in 2016, I moved to southern Spain, and I actually started my own business because there was not really an opportunity to do any kind of related work in that area where we moved to. So I started my own little consulting business, and I did some remote consulting before remote was really a thing. So I know today it would be easier, but it was great there. And when I returned to the US in 2018, I joined actually Deloitte, Bersin by Deloitte Group, to work on research on all of these topics. So I'm like, oh, that's really cool because I can apply my practitioner background, my consulting background, and also my data and analytics background to do all sorts of research on all of these topics and work with many different companies and organizations around the world on that. And then in 2020, and I'm almost done with my story, I swear. 2020, I got the opportunity to actually join Josh at his new venture, because the day I joined Deloitte, it took so long to get hired, of course, there, was the day that Josh retired from Deloitte. And so I sent him an email when I came. I'm like, I'm here, we can start working together. But we couldn't, because he was retiring that very day. Sure. But in 2020, I got the opportunity to join him and others in the Josh Bersin Company on his new venture that we're doing now, and leading all the research that we're doing here. So that's kind of my story.
Very exciting. And so we're fellow geeks as well. And it's always wonderful to talk to people who can understand not only the business problem, but also the mathematics that underlie the business problem.
Yes. Yeah. That's exactly right.
And that's why you're on the HR Data Labs podcast today.
Super excited about that.
And we are too. But what we ask we ask all of our guests is one fun thing that no one knows about Kathi.
So I was thinking about the one fun fact. What's not so fun is what I already shared, that I have a PhD in mathematics. So I thought
everybody knows that now, Kathi.
Everybody knows about that. Exactly. So here's one fun fact, and actually relates to the topic of DEI too. So when I came back to the US, I just told you my story. In 2018, I came back to the US and I started looking for another opportunity to work in a big company, or in a company really, from having my own business. I read some article on about a research study. What's the number one reason that stops people in the US from having an executive position? And the number one reason that this academic study found was having a foreign accent. So I was like, okay, well, clearly I have a foreign accent. You all hear this, right? It's an Austrian accent. I've lived in English-speaking countries for a long time, and my English is certainly not bad, but I always have an accent, right? So I'm like, okay, so if I want to get a great job here, I need to get rid of my accent. And so I started actually trying this app out that you speak into, and it corrects your pronunciation. Huh. And I tried it for like a week, and it was so frustrating. I tried every day. I spent an hour every day on it, and it corrected me on everything, like every single word. And I'm like, and I was getting so frustrated. And then I'm like, after a week, I said, screw it. If people don't like me for who I am, I'm going to give up, and I don't want to work with them anyway. So I gave up on that app, and I gave up on getting rid of my accent. And I'm like, I'll own my accent, and this is who I am. And if people don't like it, they're not right for me anyway.
Absolutely, totally agree, 100%.
Story.
Yeah, and that actually is a really good transition to our topic today, which is around diversity, equity, and inclusion analytics, and talking about how we can use math, we can use analytics to not just measure, but also to understand who actually are the people who work for our organization and how it impacts the business problem. So I guess, Kathi, one of the best places to start on that is just to ask, in your mind, what are DE&I analytics, and why are they important to organizations today?
This is William Tincup, and I'd like to direct you to a wonderful limited series podcast that Ryan and I recorded live at the ERE Recruiting Innovation Summit. We sat down with 20 recruiting and TA leaders from around the world to hear what today's best recruiters are doing to stay sharp, stay relevant, and stay ahead. It's called The Talent Shift. You'll love it. You'll find the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Listen, like, review, share. Do you?
Yeah, and it's a topic that's really near and dear to my heart, and that I'm very passionate about because of my own background and of course other backgrounds too, and having observed of people either being included or not being included, or having opportunities or not having opportunities for just who they are as a person, and how that also impacts organizations negatively if you don't give people opportunities to advance and to be successful in your company. But what I'd like to start about first is, before we talk about the analytics, what is diversity, equity, and inclusion? Because that's another thing that people sometimes get confused, and they use these words sometimes interchangeably. So when you think about diversity, I would think about the the mix of people. So it's the being invited to the party, right? Or like being part of the party, right? The whole thing about that. So it's the mix of the similarities and differences in a group. So a person can't be diverse, right? A person is who they are. So in Austria, I'm not diverse because I have an Austrian accent, obviously, and everybody else has an Austrian accent. We talk about it, right? So a person is never diverse. A group can be diverse. So the diversity is, of course, many, many different measures. It could be gender, it could be sexual orientation, it could be age, right? We see all these things about ageism and all of that. And I live in the Silicon Valley, and there you are old when you're over 35. So it could be age, and of course it could be race, it could be ethnicity, it could be economic background, it could be many, many different factors, and religion or any of these kind of things. It could be many, many different factors. So diversity is pretty easy to measure if you think about the analytics around that, right? You can count some of these observable things, and you can even ask people about the not so observable things and get some measure of how diverse your team is or how diverse your group is. So diversity measures are pretty easy to measure, and that's why most companies measure them. Equity is, of course, a lot harder to measure, and maybe we start with inclusion first and then we turn around with equity. So inclusion is a perception, it's a feeling, right? Do I feel like I belong? Do I feel valued? Do I feel like I can bring my accent, for example, to work in my case, or any of those kind of things? And inclusion is a lot harder to measure because it's a sentiment. So how do you measure sentiment? Of course, you can ask people, you can observe their behaviors, you can observe if they're part of meetings, all of those kind of things. You can do either surveys or observe how people interact with each other. So that's kind of inclusion measures. And it's a lot harder to do that. But there's still some inclusion indices out there and all of that you could either buy into or create your own one. So, and many tools out there, of course, for employee opinions and employee perception.
I think one of the things that we have to overcome as well is that DE&I used to be thought of as being affirmative action. It used to be something that we had to do because a government told us we had to do it. And now the perception needs to change to be, this is who we need to be, because our culture needs to represent not just what we want to be as a company, but who we want to serve as a company as well. Who are we catering to? What are our customers? And how do they perceive who we are and how we treat people, and make sure that that falls in line with our culture and our marketing?
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm thinking back on my time at Kaiser Permanente, for example, where we had a lot of different members, of course, who were members of our health plan and our health services. And I live in California, and there actually our majority was minority, if that makes sense. But most of our nurses, most of our healthcare professionals were not minority. So there were usually white women. Right. Most of the nursing professional is very well known. Average age is 54, right? So, but if you have a lot of people from Mexican descent, for example, which we have a lot of people because California used to be Mexico not that long ago. So they're not even immigrants, right? They're people that have lived here for generations. We always thought about how can we actually represent the communities that we serve in our employee population. Right. So that was always very important for us. And I think that's a way of thinking about who you need to be as a company. Can you represent your customers? Can you be, when your customer comes to you for your services, for your products, do they feel there's somebody who is like them? Do they feel welcome? Do they feel like somebody speaks their language, literally and figuratively?
But I think it actually goes even deeper, and we've seen customer experiences, especially early last year. We saw customer experiences where people were being very open and honest about how they would, especially African-American, customers would walk into a Starbucks, and because of everything that had been happening with BLM, there was a lot of tension between that customer and the store. And I'm not trying to pick on Starbucks, but it happened a lot in a lot of different retail situations where there was almost a hair trigger on, calling the police because, we thought something was going to happen. And, a lot of African-American people, they looked at the people behind the counter and they did not see the same race of people. And they said, oh my gosh, I'm not being represented here. Does Starbucks really feel like a place I belong? And it's correct. I mean, that's what I mean when I talk about how it's kind of become, it used to be let's check the box that we're doing something for the government, but now it has to be about who we are and how we represent.
Yeah, and there's tons of studies out there, and we found that in our study too, when we studied diversity, equity, inclusion, that diversity at all levels, including board members,
Right.
including executives, results in much higher financial performance, customer satisfaction, innovation, on and on and on. Of course, engagement and retention of your people too, because this revolving
Right.
door from a people practice is real, right? You might check the box to bring in an African-American woman, for example, and then she sees all these white men in their 20s or something, and what is she going to do? She's probably going to say, well, this is not my place because nobody's going to listen to me and nobody even looks like me, nobody thinks like me, and I'm going to turn around and leave. And so you just created a little bit worse situation for your company too, because you had somebody who just turned around and left you right away. So yeah, I think there's like tons of things, of course, going on in this area, including, of course, you see what's going on at IBM, for example, right now with the ageism kind of thing and all of those. Like, there's many different dimensions that you got to think about. And it's not just a nice to have. It's not just a legal requirement. I'm not a big fan of quotas because I think it doesn't serve companies. It doesn't serve even the population that are underrepresented.
No, but quotas are looking at the problem wrong as well. I mean, it's not about that.
Exactly.
I think you mentioned this just now, which is that when someone walks into an organization, they want to feel not just that they're represented, but they're comfortable. And if they look at the executive team or the board members and they feel like the board represents them, that there are people there who look like them, who talk like them, who can actually be an example for them of here's what you can aspire to in this organization. That's what people want to feel. And I think one of the things that the Great Awakening or resignation or whatever you want to call it has given us is that people want to be comfortable and they want to be happy and they want to enjoy work as much as they have at home. They want to actually feel like those hours they're putting into their jobs matter and that they feel like the organization reflects them.
Yes, absolutely. You know, it's absolutely true. And I think it's actually a great sign that people are much more empowered now that they say, well, I'm just going to pack up and leave and go somewhere else and take my talent and all my work and the 40, 50, 60 hours, however much I put in, into a place where I feel valued, where I feel welcome, where I feel happy. So I think it's actually a good thing that people feel that empowered. The power has shifted, and I think it's not going to go back anywhere.
Let's hope not.
It's not going to go back to organizations.
Well, people have found their voice. And like I was talking to a CEO the other day, and they said people are voting with their feet, which is a good thing. And now we as organizations and leaders of organizations, we have to start catering to them more so than we ever have before. Not just through pay, because you can't pay people enough to be in hell, but to feel like they're part of something better.
It's so true. I'm always thinking about how pay impacts or doesn't impact employee experience and engagement and all of that. And it's very short-lived, right? Because you don't get up every day and say, here's my paycheck, here's my big bonus. Right. I'm going to do my best work. It's like it goes a little while and maybe you think about it. If you get a big raise, you get a big bonus, you think about it like a week or something like that, maybe. And then you're like, okay, yeah, that's good. But I also did a lot of great work, so I kind of earned it.
Oh, exactly.
and
that's the point.
Think about something else.
That's the point. I did the work, I earned it. Now, and this is something my father used to say to me that his people used to say to him, what have you done for me lately? You know, as an employee, they'd say that to him, the boss, and say, what have you done for me lately? And he actually saw that as a really huge negative. And I said, Dad, and this is when I was a consultant already. I said, hey, Dad, what have you done for them lately? And it was a very honest question. And he could, oh, shut up, boy. Because he didn't want to be put in that position. But I think a lot of managers, they don't have the answer. And that's why they get very frustrated by that. Right. And things tend to go pretty badly when they're faced with that. So HR really needs to step up their game to be able to help managers be able to answer that question better than shut up, boy, which my dad loved to tell me.
Yes. It's so true. Yeah, we did a big study on employee experience, which I'm not going to dive too much into, but we found of all the things that a company can do to create a great experience, the number one thing that drives the employee experience is trust in the organization. So do they trust you? Do you feel like you're a leader that does something for them, right? Not just, well, I paid you,
right,
obviously, but I also gave you my work. But what else have you done for me? Because I did above and beyond. I didn't just check the boxes and see that I worked my 8 hours or something. I'm not a clock puncher, right? I did a lot more. So what a lot more have you done for me? And if people don't feel like they can trust the organization, they're just going to pack it up.
One of the things we actually do a lot of surveys to to check employee sentiment. We had a survey that we had just done very recently, in fact, in the last month and a half, and it said that employees don't believe that their managers have those answers right now, even though in another question, they said, managers are the people I turn to first before HR to answer the questions. Managers don't have the skills or the tools to be able to help them. So it's tough.
And it's true. And I think it's sometimes a little bit unfair to managers because people usually are put in manager positions without knowing what that even means, right?
Sure.
They're good at that job. I'm a great salesperson, then I'm going to be a sales manager. I'm like, oh, what does it even mean? Because being a great salesperson doesn't mean you're a great people manager. Right. Usually it's actually kind of opposite like directions. So my husband is a software architect. So if you're a great software architect, then you get put in a management position, but you actually don't want that, right? You don't want to talk with people all day long. You want to code something really cool, right? Or nurse manager was the same thing. Yeah.
It's not a natural skill set. And it's true that so many managers get put into their position, but there's no training on how to even become a manager. It's just sort of trial by fire.
Yeah, we had at Kaiser Permanente, the hardest job to keep people at was nurse manager because nurse manager, you put a nurse into that and they want to see patients. That's why they become a nurse. But then you have to do scheduling and you got to do paperwork and you got to do performance evaluations and like all that like boring stuff that doesn't have anything to do with the patient. And people self-demoted into nurse roles as well.
So the Peter principle is really true, which is what we're talking about. And one of the things that we've been consulting with clients on is creating career tracks for their employees where they understood when you go from this job to this job to this job, what are the skills you need to acquire or develop in order to actually get to that other role? Because, and especially today, it's really, really true today because of so much compression in compensation. And we're going to get to why this is important in a second for the next question. But one of the things that companies aren't doing a very good job of is telling people, when I can't increase your pay because you didn't develop those skills to be able to get to the next level, and therefore I have to slow down your rate of pay because you're getting too expensive inside your grade, because we've held that stuff very secretively, those grades and those structures and things. Now with DE&I, we're opening things up with pay transparency, giving more people access to knowing how did my pay get developed and being more empowered about that. And then that leads to people being able to take more control of their career inside that organization. I don't know if you've actually seen that in Bersin.
Yeah, we have seen that a lot, actually. What the pay equity is actually a huge topic that comes up, believe it or not, many different topics that we study. So we studied, for example, employee experience, which I shared with you, and we had two questions in there. One of them was around pay equity, and another one was around above average pay and benefits. And we ranked all of these practices that were like 76 or something. We ranked all of them in their correlation to outcomes, business outcomes, people outcomes, innovation outcomes. And pay equity was number 6, so very high up. And there were many other things like trust in leadership, those kind of things. And above average pay and benefits was number 70. So it was way below. Yeah. It was way low, right? And we see that correlation also with health and well-being, for example. So pay equity actually has a huge impact on employee health and well-being. So when we studied health and well-being, we saw that transparency of pay, comparable pay, fair pay that's perceived as fair, not just that is fair, but also do people know it's fair. It doesn't really help if you do a lot of pay equity work, but nobody knows you're doing that, or you're actually looking at leveling the playing field. So I think that's a really important consideration as well. So pay equity is a huge problem that I think we're just scratching the surface right now.
Like what you hear so far? Make sure you never miss a show by clicking subscribe. This podcast is made possible by Salary.com. Now, back to the show.
Let's talk about how and what companies are doing in DEI and analytics, and where do they get started on it. So let's talk about first, what have people been doing to actually measure these things? And then how can people start?
Yeah, so when we did a big DEI study, we studied many, many different topics of DEI, because DEI is, of course, embedded in many different areas of HR and the business. One thing that we found out was when we interviewed several DEI leaders of Target and Hyatt and like big companies basically on what they were doing too. One of the DI leaders told us, and it really resonated with us, you got to approach DI as a business practice, not as an HR program, right? And what that means is, of course, you're going to measure it too, because you would never do your marketing strategy without knowing first where you stand and setting goals and then tracking progress. So it becomes very natural that you have to do full DI measures and outcome measures, including not just diversity measures, but also equity and inclusion measures, in order to run DI like a business. So that's one thing. Most companies are struggling with the effective use of DI metrics. And the reason for that is, I think, a number of reasons. And they don't have to just do with the data side. So I don't even want to talk a lot about data. I think one thing that gets in the way of effective DI metrics and analytics is lack of HR skills. We saw in our HR capability assessment that 4 in 5 HR people are very inexperienced in putting DI metrics together. Sure. And we have 8,000 people that have taken our HR capability assessment. So it's a pretty broad data set. And I think the reason for that is that it's usually relegated to either people analytics teams or DI teams. But any HR person actually, and any manager has to know what these metrics are, because they need to use them in their own business day of work, right? If you want to run it like a business, you can't just say, oh, here's our people analytics team, which is usually a small team, right? Yeah. And we had one at Kaiser Permanente too that I was running, and we had 10 or 15 people, but we had 220,000 employees. So like these analytics groups can't do that. So that's one reason why it's not very effective. I think the other thing that's happening there is most companies focus mostly on the D of DEI and not so much on the E and the I. And we talked about why that is, because it's hard to get there, right? It's pretty easy to count heads, and it's pretty hard to evaluate inclusion or equity, but you absolutely have to do it, because that's where really the crux of your DI strategy is in the E and I, not just on the D.
I think again, going back to one of the things we were talking about before, I think a lot of times people think about the E potentially as being pay equity, which really isn't necessarily, but it also might come into the engagement surveys piece of being able to sneak in questions that question how people feel, not just about what they do and where they are, meaning the manager and the business, but also because of who they are. And the people who had been running those studies in the past really hadn't had the writ. They hadn't had the leverage to be able to cut the data by those particular factors.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when you look at averages, things always look great, right? Yeah. If you look at, you don't see the outliers. So you got to look at in a much more detailed level where the outliers is. If we, for example, have high engagement or high inclusion perception, is it the same for African American women in their 50s as it is for white men in their 20s? And maybe not. Maybe yes, maybe no. But if you don't look at these cuts, the diversity cuts of inclusion service, you will never know, right? Mm-hmm. And so how is it by tenure, by different diversity groups, by age groups, by on and on and on, all of these different groups. And that's really where it's at. It's not just about measuring heads on teams, which is kind of a basic thing, and we talked about AAP and EEOC reporting, which of course is the lowest bar, right? But you won't get to full value of DEI if you're stopping at the legal compliance kind of rules.
No, and I think one of the problems also is that you need to do that Rubik's Cube and keep turning the analyses to find where those problem spots may exist, and they may be hidden, very hidden, and not give up. And that means you have to have somebody who has really good data programming skills to be able to find those nuggets of truth, because they're just not going to be there for you. You have to really dig.
Well, you have to have those people that have that inherent sense of curiosity.
Exactly.
If you're lacking the curiosity, because it is a treasure hunt, and it takes a long time, and it takes a lot of energy, and if you don't have the curiosity driving that, you really are not going to start to get those insights from the data.
Totally agree.
Absolutely. No, it's so true. It reminds me of my mathematics studies, of course. You don't know where the nugget is going to be, so you just got to keep digging, right? Because nobody can tell you the answer. Otherwise, they'd already have done it.
Exactly.
Well, and the problem is because this data constantly evolves, there is no one answer either. It's the problem is going to be it's on a continuum. And to your point before, because the organization is breathing and this has to become a business process, and part of how everybody lives and everybody works, it may need necessarily some training or some retraining on things we used to do in the past.
Oh, absolutely. You constantly have to evolve it because the way that you can actually get to these insights evolves all the time too. If you think, for example, about organizational network analysis, which we didn't have when I started out working, but now you can actually see who is working with whom and what are the connections and where are the barriers to working together. Can you see, for example, if women in a certain age group are working with the senior executive man in another age group, do they have these barriers where, like the glass ceiling or anything like that? You can see it in behavioral data too, not just from asking people, accounting heads. Like nudging is another thing that, of course, nudge technology is another interesting thing, right? That we're not able to do in the past, and now we can, because it really personalizes your insights for yourself, not for people like you, but for yourself.
So, Kathi, we talked about what is DE&I, and we talked about how people need to make it an important part of the business and a business problem, not just an HR problem. Mm-hmm. We also talked about how people are measuring these things and where and how to get started in DE&I. What did we miss, though? I know we could probably fill a couple of more episodes, but what else would you tell people before we close?
Yeah, I just tell, like summing it up, a few insights, 3 points really, because I always like to think in threes, 3 points on how you can make a bigger difference with DI analytics. So first thing is, and we all found that out from studying the topic at length with many, many different companies. First one is an outside-in orientation. So rather than just comparing internally and looking at your internal DI measures and metrics, compare them also to external benchmarks and comparison and work with other companies to learn from them on what they're doing. And so many big companies that we talked with, Target, Accenture, Kaiser Permanente, on and on and on, they have dedicated analytics experts that collaborate with other groups in other companies to understand what they are doing and just pull over some of these insights from other companies. So don't just look at your company walls, broaden the spectrum, because DI is a big problem that you can't solve alone within your company, of course. The second point I'd make is, and we talked about that at length too, is focus on inclusion and belonging, not just diversity. So just looking at diversity measures, you miss the bigger picture of the inclusion metrics where it's really the value of DI comes out. So focus on these inclusion metrics, create your own inclusion index or use one that's already created, and just start cutting the data in many different dimensions as we talked about. And the last point we also hit on is transparency. So many tech companies, for example, they share their diversity stats publicly because they've been forced to, right? So they've been forced to share their, like, how many people of color do they have? How many women do they have in engineering? Those kind of things. And that's important, but what's even more important is internal transparency. So people don't want to find out from the media on how you are doing within your organization. They want to do more. They want to know more about what you're doing to help them, how to create more diversity, equity, inclusion in your company. They want to have it earlier. They want to have more detail, and they want to have just also insights on progress, good or bad. Even if you didn't make progress, you're also going to share it internally and tell people, this is what we tried. This is where it was not successful, and this is what we're going to try next. So sharing internally, transparency is very important, but internal transparency is actually more important than external transparency. So those are the 3 kind of nuggets that I wanted to share.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Kathi. Thank you for coming, and we're going to definitely ask you back to go into more detail.
Yep, definitely.
We love geeks like us, and you are definitely one of us.
Like-minded people.
We could talk for
hours. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, totally. Right. Well, thank you so much, David and Dwight. I really, really appreciate your time, and looking forward to joining you again soon.
That'd be great. Dwight, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, and thank you so much, Kathi, for being here.
And thank you all for listening. And if you like this episode, please subscribe or hit follow. And if you know somebody who might find value in it, please send it to them. Thank you very much. Take care, and please stay safe.
That was the HR Data Labs podcast. If you liked the episode, please subscribe. And if you know anyone that might like to hear it, please send it their way. Thank you for joining us this week, and stay tuned for our next episode. Stay safe.